the public and history. What is public history? There is no clear consensus on its definition. It began to be recognized as its own special subset of historical study in the 1970s and has increasingly become more and more important in the 21st century. Thomas Calvin argues that there's three key features that he likes to use in his definition of what is public history, and that is that the communication of history to non-academic audiences, a public participation, and the application of historical methodology to present-day issues. Also see the National Council on Public History's website for more on how to define and how to think about public history. It's been argued that public history arose out of the efforts to connect ivory tower historians more fully to the public. And of course, one of the ironies of it is that academics create public history programs. And you could argue that historians have never been really isolated from the public, and the public has not really been isolated from history. Nevertheless, consider what kind of history you think is public history, and also consider, do you find this sort of characterization of the town and gown, or the town and the university, of being suspicious and distrustful of each other, a fair characterization? Well, next, let's look at a few examples of public history, and the public and history, through your readings. And also I just posted this pie chart here. If you're wondering what do public historians actually do, this is dated. It's over 10 years old, but public historians tend to find their careers where other historians find their careers. So public historians maybe are not that different from other historians, but get jobs in museums, the college or university, or in the state or government positions. Now I want to look at, in terms of our readings, some of the different kinds of use of public history. And one is the corporate history. And initially public history was focused on military history, government, and corporate history. And then as the decades rolled on in the 20th century, public history became more about heritage management than about business and government history. Think about the differences between heritage and history and the inherent problems that might be in the historical realm getting into the heritage management business. Calvin Coolidge famously said that the chief business of the American people is business, and I think that Taylor Alexandra Curie's article on DuPont Turns 150 is a good example of how corporate issues then are tied into an American identity and a public identity. And Curie argues that the DuPont executives were eager to create a useful identity for the DuPont company, wanted it to be legitimized and celebrated, and were highly successful in their efforts. In part, you want to keep in mind why this was so important for DuPont is that DuPont, like some of the other corporations coming out of World War I, had been characterized as being deadly munitions dealers. And so DuPont was eager to get away from this identity and craft a new one to show it as a leader of a better America through chemistry. So essentially, by DuPont creating a new identity, it helps to craft a new identity for America also, where the corporate values that make DuPont great make America great. So the corporations lead the way on what it means to be American. And these values are normalized, they're fostered, they become public values. And so essentially the DuPont and others are very effective in creating this narrative that an American free enterprise creates a great America. And if this narrative is created of American free enterprise, then the narrative of the value of organized labor or the value of union movements then is delegitimized because they're in opposition with each other. So the companies have been very effective in sort of crafting a story that promotes the corporate identity and shows organized labor, for example, as not a part of sort of the American values. Go to the corporate history website, Google corporation, and check out its crafted identity, and it's a very interesting process. So corporate culture has become public culture, and then there's other companies you can think of, I'm sure, that also illustrate this point, which shows that the corporate success narrative becomes the American success narrative. Curie makes an important point, I think, when she states that history is not something that happens to an organization, but is a process that managers control and shape, and historical narratives used as a strategic resource. Keep that in mind, the importance of using historical narratives to be able to frame your story, to make it a story that shows success. Oral history is another example of public history, and oral history is very popular, particularly in terms of documentaries. It's a very satisfying way of seeing somebody tell their story. The public gets to participate in the creating of history, of telling their story and sharing that authority and that authorial voice. It gives the public greater power in telling its story of its role in history. So it can be a very powerful tool. If you need to make sure that you check on IRB, the Institutional Review Board, that you have done everything necessary when using oral interviews. One of the things to think about, oral history can be very satisfying, but what are some of the problems of oral history, particularly the role of memory and remembering, and is it a true story? Historical commemorations are also, I think, a really big part of sort of public history, of forming public history. National holidays are a good example of this sort of creation of a national history narrative, and consider how states particularly decide to celebrate themselves and how cultures celebrate themselves, and why these celebrations are so important in fashioning the social cohesion of a community. But also for states throughout the centuries, states need a narrative and a way to tie their narrative to the past to legitimize their powers. Legitimizing narratives are essential, and one way to create legitimizing narratives of power are through national holidays and celebrations and rituals and monuments and parades. So consider what to celebrate, what to commemorate, how to remember. And these are all important things in shaping a public national narrative, and what political agendas are being served. And talking about being served, frequently these national holidays are consuming holidays where alcoholic beverages play a big role, but also consuming greeting cards and other things, flowers. What does that tell us? So think about what holidays we celebrate and how we celebrate them, and what this tells us about ourselves and society. I want to look at one example, though, and that's of Russia and its use of public space and political space and historical space. And this red squares are just a great example of this, where you have Lenin's mausoleum next to St. Basil's wonderful cathedral that was done during the time of Ivan III, with the statue celebrating the heroes of 1612 right next to it. So the Russian example. The Soviet Union collapses. So the Revolution Day, November 7th, which celebrates the overthrow of the provisional government by the Bolshevik Party, no longer is valid. A new national narrative, a new national holiday has to be created. And this was a thought that was kicked around during Boris Yeltsin's time, but Putin then finalizes the idea of creating a new national holiday, having it on November 4th, which is pretty close to November 7th, for a National Unity Day, and having this come sort of tied back to 1612 at the end of the time of troubles. Really nothing happens on November 4th, but it's a convenient date to create a new national holiday. New states need new foundation myths. They need new legitimizing narratives. And this is essentially what Putin's government did, is it creates a new holiday that builds on new legitimizing narratives. And this narrative is that in 1612, the end of the time of troubles, the Russian state and society was in complete disarray, but through the Russian heroes, it vanquished its foreign enemies, it created a new powerful state, and gave birth to this new powerful idea of Russian nationalism that led to this great Russian empire. And indeed, self-sacrifice was necessary, but sacrifice is important for the motherland. So this new myth that takes place, the Romanovs make a comeback in this story. And to read a wonderful novel on this time period and coming up with the Russian idea, check out Victor Pelevin's Homo Sapiens. It's a hoot. Also, just think about American examples. We'll be looking at this in more detail later on, but think about the national narrative of Columbus Day, or the Thanksgiving Day, or the Founding Fathers narrative, and consider what is left out of state narratives. What are state narratives telling us? And the importance of where holidays take place in terms of the parades and where the flags are flown, where monuments are placed. That location is very important. Public space is often used for political space, and this is done very consciously. So location is very important, and how that location is named, because you name a space, you own the space. So regime change is very aware of the importance of changing this identity, this narrative, this story, and using parades and demonstrations and monuments and flags to legitimize and reinforce this story. Another kind of public history is in terms of museums and how museums present the public historical exhibits and narratives. I think there's a really interesting roundtable on the display of arms and the question of, do museums have special ethical responsibilities? How do you exhibit and narrate contentious, decisive displays? How do you please the public when it has certain expectations and historians have other expectations? And how do you display material culture? What makes a display of firearms different from a display of guitars, for example? I know the question of violence is one crucial aspect, but also what is essential is that collections need context, and you've got to go then beyond just like racks of guitars or racks of guns and place them into the proper context, because a gun is more than a gun. It's an object that needs to be contextualized, and then the audience can reflect on these contextualized objects and come up with a better understanding themselves. So artifacts talk if one listens, and you need to be able to reflect and think about those objects. And we'll get back to the idea of that question of, do museums have special ethical responsibilities or not later on. But it is a very interesting question. Memorials also very interesting in terms of the public in history. This delightful memorial of animals in war is an example of space used and this message it's trying to convey, and whether or not it's a good monument. What makes it a good monument? And Valmel Schwartz, I think, presents a case that, like holidays, memorials are used in much the same way for social cohesion, but one of the differences between sort of holidays and a memorial is that a memorial specifically stakes out sort of a sacred public space where hopefully the memorial is understood. And I ask you, what do you think of this memorial? It's about animals in war, but I think a really good point is that any narrative written by a human being is ultimately a human narrative. Also, and we'll get back to this a little later during this semester, that humans, they want to share their history, so family history as public history, and consider why sharing our past is so important. So context is key, and keep it real.